to meet up like this at last.
Yes.
Home to home.
Yes.
On our walk yesterday, we passed your old farm, which was nice. And we talked about a number of things, actually. We were very chatty yesterday.
Well, you were. I was listening.
Fair cop. Okay, one of the things I talked about and you listened was we both acknowledged that there was a lot of what you might call old-fashioned values, such as service to others, selflessness, a sort of what's in it for me attitude. Yeah, so I was interested in your response, John, to my comment about old values, and you said that it was both something that you learned, indeed, growing up in the family, but also at the school you went to, and I wanted to see if you would reflect on how things have changed and what can be done about it, if anything.
Oh, well, I'm not so sure about that latter question. Well, yes, maybe yes, I could. It would come back to that. Yes, but just to recap, because it was interesting, because honestly, I'd rather forgotten myself. But there was something on, I saw, there was a Netflix film where a sort of period film where these things were referred to. And I thought, well, yes, that's the way I was brought up. Well, I was sent to boarding school at the age of 7 after a country boyhood. And these things were certainly impressed on me, taught to me throughout my schooling. And my father was very much on this way of thinking, and he also was in no doubt that of the direction he should point me in. And perhaps the first word that I was reminded of was that of duty. Yes, duty. What was not what I wanted to do, but what was the right thing to do. Well, I didn't question that. My elders and betters impressed on me what was the right thing to do, and I didn't have much choice about it. But I think, like with most of the other boys, it was nothing that caused any reaction to me. It was perfectly acceptable, because I suppose in my childish mind it was reasonable and sensible, and yes, right. And similar to duty was the idea of service. To serve others. Life wasn't for my own advantage, it was for the service of others. That was the noblest form of work. Not what's in it for me, which was a completely foreign, I don't think that ever entered my head, really. Service, duty, helping others. And we referred to sport, didn't we? And I was saying that all this modern emphasis on winning and, yeah, I've got a gold, I've got a gold medal and all this sort of thing, demonstration you get now, knock the microphone over that you get on sports with, was absolutely, I'd never seen or heard of such a thing. The idea of sport wasn't to win. The idea of sport was good sportsmanship, to play the game. And it was just as important, if not more important, to be a good loser than to be a winner. And it was, I was taught to box as a young man, and I don't know if modern boxers do it, but it was absolutely obligatory to shake hands with your opponent before you started and at the end of the bout, if you were only still able to do it. Certainly. And if somebody scored a goal, or well, it was a try, because it was rugby I played, not ordinary football, you know, if it was a good match, the opponents would congratulate you. It wasn't a matter of all your teammates piling in, and well, of course, everyone was pleased, but it was entirely sort of considered right for your opponents to, well played, sir, well played. Butler, they call me by my surname then. Yes, this idea of gain, of either. And another thing that was considered, that there wasn't the same emphasis on academic achievement. We did have exams, but it was nothing like the sort of quite sort of frenetic emphasis on getting grades there. The most important thing, well, were these qualities I've just been talking about. And I think really both the schools that I went to esteemed far more your success on the sports field. Unfortunately, I didn't enjoy competitive sports. I never did very much. I was a bit of a failure at school, but the most admired people in school weren't the clever ones. It was the ones that were good at rugby or cricket. The captain of cricket or of the rugby team was the most admired chap in school, not the ones that passed the exams. So I think, I think those were the marks of success in life. That it was the kindness you brought to life, the unselfishness, the idea of serving. And, there was a phrase then called noblesse oblige, which, of course, is French for the obligations of the nobility. Well, I was far from coming from a noble family, but my father had a good job in business and was able to pay for a private education. So in a way, I was born not with a golden spoon, at least with a probably not even a silver one, but at least a nice spoon in my mouth. I had some advantages in life and a good education, but it wasn't for my advantage. This was so that I might contribute the more to society. This was, my golly, that's the way my father looked at it. He says, you've received more than your share. You've got to give more than your share. This was what was drummed into my young mind, and I've lived with it all my life, really. I've always felt that way. Interesting that when I joined the army, it was the army was called service, national service. Service. Yes, it was service. What was the army for? The army was to protect the weak, wasn't it? People get a very screwed up idea about the army, being aggressive, going out killing, all about empire building and all that. Well, I don't say it's not a part of it, but the primary part of the service was in service to others, the nation, the needs of the nation, including the response before the welfare state was formed, and the responsibility for caring for the underprivileged in society fell fairly and squarely on the shoulders of the privileged. That was the duty of the privileged. There may be a few selfish ones who didn't do that. Well, of course, you get that in every society, the bad eggs, don't you? But I think the great majority of those that had the advantages was to help others.
And when you first became a farmer here in Bakewell, the same ethos, I suspect, went into your farming. I remember you saying when we were at your second farm in Bicker, you saw your duty to the land as being to leave it in a better state than you found it.
Oh, absolutely, Phil. Yes, service to the land. That's absolutely right. Yes, yes, serve the land. Yes, leave it better than you found it. The duty of a farmer, that's the word duty again. The duty of a farmer is to leave the land better than he found it.
When did you notice any sort of shift of the mindset of British society to
Yes.
let's call it well, what shall we call it?
Modern thinking. Yes. A difficult one, Phil, to pinpoint a point. It was.
Let's call it the entitlement culture.
Yes, entitlement culture. Yes, yes. Human rights. Yes, human rights is a very questionable philosophy, really. Human duty is much more to the point, you know. Human duty rather than human rights, because human rights so often centers on what you call the lowest common denominator, which is, of course, the ego, which is me. What's in it for me? And this is very commonly interpreted not as the highest and most noble of human aspirations, but often the basest. One's own self-interest, which is, of course, what is spiritually speaking is the ego, is the me, which is the devil, which is the cause of all our trouble. So anything that emphasizes the me is really not to our advantage at all, but to the contrary. Beware, my friends.
Would it be fair to say, or too simplistic to say, that the whole boom in what's called personal development, you know, there's a whole industry of books and workshops and videos.
Well, you see, it depends what the emphasis is on. All too commonly in society, without wise guidance, when this is left to the individual who knows no better, this self-development is the ego, is me. What's in it for me? Now then, there is, of course, a higher self, and the traditional interpretation of that question, Phil, is the soul. And traditionally, the church's purpose was the salvation of the soul, which was the development of this higher faculty of man, which is called the soul. And that is the achievement of, the attainment rather, of eternal life, which really was the point, the true human destiny. Well, now you see this self-development is focused on the lower nature of man, which simply develops the ego, more and more of me, which means less and less salvation of the soul, which means you may get a few more years in this life, but so what? You're still on death row, doomed to die. And the church has largely abdicated the responsibility of teaching the salvation of the soul, has become as humanistic as most of the other traditional institutions. By humanistic, I refer, of course, to the mortality, the mortal aspect of man. The higher aspect of man is spirit, is the soul, which is spirit, which is already complete. It doesn't need what it needs is realization.
You're not doing your prospects any good, John, for that application you've got in to be a vicar.
Oh, I think the church has long since wiped me off the slate. You know, I can tell you as a joke now, but at the time it upset me greatly. Many years ago, when I was a young man, I'd recently learned to meditate, and I was absolutely thrilled with this new discovery of meditation, which to me, more than anything I'd come across before, made spirituality practical. I went off with great enthusiasm to share this knowledge with the church, and made one or two attempts to become a priest. And finally, I was dismissed with the comment, "I'm not sufficiently Christian." Mm-hmm. Well, with my tail between my legs, I rather shrank away from from the church. But since then, I've been able to take that comment with a pinch of salt and even rather laugh about it. And join the goodly company of the heretics and those that paddle their own canoe through this puzzling life. Oh dear.
I'm reminded of Groucho Marx's comment. He wouldn't want to belong to a club that would have him as a member.
Well, no, I've always seriously, I've always felt a bit sorry that.
But I congratulated you yesterday, if you remember, that you've always been your own man. To thine own self be true. You're not in the line of any other teacher, are you?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I've always. I've never really found a human guide in this life that that I would. I was very well taught by a school of meditation, but I always felt that nature was my number one teacher. Still do, really. Look at me. I just raise my eyes, look up at the sky outside my window, and there's lovely hillside opposite. It's all shrouded in mist today, and there's snow on the ground. I can't see the top of the hill, but it's always beautiful. And somehow, one of the first things I learned from, I may not be a very good Christian, but I was very well schooled in the Bible as a boy. I had 10 years of compulsory chapel and scripture lessons. So I know the Bible pretty well. And one of the early phrases I loved as a boy was from the Psalms, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help." And it does all throughout my life. I've been helped by that phrase, and I still do lift up mine eyes unto the hills. And I immediately feel expanded and taken out of all this nonsense of human argument, of this and that, and held in the don't need words, do I? Held in the what I like to call the everlasting arms.
Not only lifting your eyes up, John, yesterday on our walk when it was sunny, you drew my attention downwards to the moss growing.
Ah, yes. Ah, the dear moss. That really melts my heart. Yes. Yes, it was striking. It was yesterday. Was it the 1st of February? It was 1st of February yesterday, wasn't it? And the first warm, sunny day we've had, really, for many, many weeks. And the moss was just sending up its seeding heads. Of course, not seeding yet, but just this first little stalks. And just in the sunlight, this early spring sunlight, on the hard stone, just conveyed that sweet, gentle humility of moss. It just melts my heart and makes me feel how lovely when one dies that moss would grow over one's grave, and what more blessed covering could one have?
Mhm.
God, if only we could be as humble as the moss, as humble and beautiful as the moss, instead of all this emphasis on human one-upmanship and arrogance and pride. And what a teacher moss is. If only we could kneel down before the moss and teach me, Master, to the moss. Wouldn't we be better off? Wouldn't that be a better guide through life than a lot of blind fools leading the blind?
It's maybe one more of the old-fashioned values, so-called, that have been lost. That is humility.
Yes, yes, we were talking about that also, weren't we, Phil? The blessed humility. Yes.
And I reckoned I was more humble than you, if you remember.
Well, that's a good thing to be competitive on. I'm more humble than you. You could, there could be a worse comparison, couldn't there? But seriously, I learned so much about humility when I went to Russia. Although I knew a bit about humility, it wasn't really until I went to Russia that, which is a country that puts enormous value on humility. Really, I don't think any quality is more highly esteemed among the ordinary Russian people than humility. And, you know, when I saw that in practice, I did recognize that as something that of the greatest value. Humility, my dears. Actually, somebody else once said that your greatest safety in this life, in fact, your only safety in this life is humility. Now then, that's something to consider, isn't it? One's only safety in this life is humility. How about that for all those that are trying to save us by injecting, what do they call it, vaccine into our veins to stop us dying of virus this year to die of something else the next. Yeah.
It's
sorry.
One of the characteristics that Paul speaks about in 1 Corinthians 13 about love is love vaunteth not itself up.
Absolutely, absolutely. How about that for all these, you know, rights, human rights? You know, my mother was Russian, and it's only really looking back on the time, of course, I didn't really understand this as I do now, that she embodied this humility. I don't hardly ever remember her talking about herself. Her entire life was spent in service to her husband and 2 children. I remember her saying that she would willingly cut herself into 3 pieces, one for Dad, one for my sister, and one for myself. This was her life. And I remember when Women's Lib came in, she thought that was a lot of nonsense. She said there's nothing wrong with a woman being a mother and housewife. Mum never had a job in a modern sense, but she was busy from morning to night, looking after. During the war, she made all her own clothes. She knitted. This woolly I'm wearing now was knitted by her. Nearly all. I still got all the old woolies she knitted for me. She knitted for all the family. The whole house was a work of art. Every handkerchief was folded as a piece of art. Every table was laid, with such loving care. She was a very fulfilled woman, and I think she was probably one of the most complete people I've ever known in life. Really, completely, yes, just complete in her love for and work for others.
The exact opposite of an entitlement mentality.
Absolutely. She wouldn't have known that word or even thought about it. No, I don't think she ever um, very rarely, I think she ever bought anything for herself apart of just the simple necessities.
There's a lovely painting of her just by your front door, isn't there?
Yes, just hanging outside my door in the passage there. Yes, when she was a young woman.
Would it be, how can we distinguish between what you might say is a healthy self-regard and an unhealthy, me first attitude? Is there a distinction we can make, John, between what might be called self-actualization, the sort of maximizing of the ego, for want of a better expression, and what you might call self-transcendence?
Yes. Yes, yes, certainly. There was an old motto that was said by the Boy Scouts. I don't know if they still say it. How did it go? I forget the first part of it, but I think the second part was to do my duty to God and man, was it? And then it ended up, and do a good deed to somebody every day. Yes, a good deed to somebody every day. Well, it's a funny thing, but when we do an act of kindness or a good deed, even if it's like picking up a bit of rubbish in the street, there's usually an extraordinary satisfaction about it, isn't there? A sort of good boy, a little pat on the shoulder, as my dad would say to me, good boy. And there's a sort of an instinctive recognition that unselfishness and just good deeds, both to your neighbor or to the land or to animals, whatever it is you're given to care for, is its own reward. It really is, because I suppose it's all to do with, you see, the law is the more you give, the more you receive. So when you give out tender, loving care, I like that expression, TLC, which I remember when it was first coined by a man called Schumacher, and it's become well known. When you give that out, you receive it. When you give love, you receive. Now, I remember one of the principles of the School of Meditation where I was taught, that which you most do lack, give that. Now then, that was a good one to remember. That which you most do lack, give that. Because as you give, so you will receive. Yes, I don't think the pleasure we get from gain is really comparable to the pleasure we get from giving, really.
It is more blessed to give than to receive, is it?
It's true, it's profoundly true. Oh, if only we were taught these things, as children, if only now. See, it really is, to my mind anyway, call me old-fashioned if you like, it's absolutely tragic how we've lost these, I'll use another old-fashioned word, these more noble principles, which actually are much closer to the truth of what man actually is, which is not only the ego and the flesh, but the soul, but the higher faculties of the mind and his soul.
I'm mindful of the younger generation who have grown up with in celebrity culture, and everybody wants to be on X Factor or
Yes.
A celebrity, and selfies and likes on the phone are
Yes.
an embedded part of a young person in particular psyche growing up, their sense of self-esteem. Any any advice to the youngsters, John?
Well, yeah, this was, yes, you asked me this. It was part of the question you originally asked, wasn't it? And of course, it's most important. Well, thank God, what really happens throughout history is that one extreme leads to another, you see. The natural law is that of balance. And we see that both in nature and in a long-term view of history. You see, civilizations rise and fall. Everything in human history has ebbs and flows. And see, when society goes too much out of balance, goes wrong, then certain individuals seem to sort of lead the way, and then gradually the balance is restored. And so the very fact that an old man like me finds himself on YouTube with a considerable audience indicates the number of, amazingly, mostly young, thank God, mostly young people who are looking for some sort of alternative to this, what's in it for me culture, spiritual alternative, which is a very healthy thing. You see, the people are turning away from religion. Well, religion in itself is to blame probably for that, but spirit beckons ever stronger, and so people will rediscover true values, because true values come from the truth, don't they? The truth. And the truth of man is that unchanging part of himself, which is called the soul. And it's in recognition of this soul, which you could call saving the soul, which brings it into the forefront of his consciousness. And then he begins to function from there, rather from his lower nature, which is this that is doomed to corrupt and die. And so gradually, and probably, who knows, not so gradually, but quite rapidly. It seems to be snowballing at the moment, doesn't it? There's this growth in interest in spirituality. Maybe this will lead to...
Surprising and encouraging. I don't think it's on the curriculum in school, John.
Well, the establishment is always the last to catch up with these things. Do you know? Think of organic, or think of the organic culture. I'm old enough to remember the very beginnings of the organic movement. There was, well, perhaps I'm not really old enough, but there was, towards the end of the last century, there was just a handful of pioneers. Strangely enough, many of them in part of the British Empire in India at that time. A few thoughtful men who considered the diet. I remember there was one classic description of the Hunza people who lived in an isolated valley in the Himalayas, who led a very organic lifestyle and had outstanding record of good health. And he studied these people and compared that to the diet of the English working people at that time, and noticed the difference, and so began to think about what's now called whole food. what a difference diet and a healthy soil could make. And so sprang into existence what's now called the organic movement. And then it's really only in the last few years that this has become a matter of public concern. The government's taken it up, and last but not least, the church has jumped on the bandwagon. But you see, these things take many years before the establishment is the last people to look for leadership, really, in these things. It's the pioneers who go first, and then gradually it rings true to more and more ears what they're saying, and gradually more people swell the movement.
Well, as you alluded to earlier, John, these values begin at home.
Absolutely, Phil, yes. That's another interesting saying, isn't it? Charity begins at home. Yes, indeed. My God. One needs. I remember my father often saying that to me when I behaved as he thought improperly at home, and was always wanting to go off to far corners of the world to do my good works. Charity begins at home. Responsibility, yes, among those you often least want to do it to. I'm afraid all too often. And so we have this extraordinary thing, don't we, that old people these days get sort of shoveled off to the state to look after, shoveled into homes, and how few families now look after their own people. The whole structure of society has changed, hasn't it? Young people leave their homes as soon as they can and set up on their own, and then of course the burden of old age is picked up by the state. Well, bully for the state, but you look at more traditional societies and you find that on the other hand, there's an integration between all ages, and each generation has a little function within a home. Well, those days are, who knows, they may return, who knows. If the government collapses and the value of money breaks down, maybe people will end up being looked after by their children again. Who knows?
I witnessed the extended family when I was fortunate to spend a couple of weeks on Bali a couple of years ago, if you remember, and that they had an extended compound, a sort of a yard with different dwellings, but for different generations of the same family, and it was absolutely delightful, I have to say.
Well, it is if it's sensibly organised. I know town dwelling and flats and all this sort of thing has made it all more difficult. Of course, traditionally people lived in the country, didn't they? And there, thinking back to my own days as a farmer, there's so many jobs that are eminently suitable for children and old people. Old people can do things that up to their dying day they can be usefully employed, just doing simple things, either outside or around the house, for feeling useful instead of just uselessly watching a television locked up in a little flat on their own. It's dreadful, isn't it? Watching.
And what's your preference, John, when you go doodle alley on us?
You mean when I die?
No, when you get sort of cronky and...
Oh, when I lose my wits. God knows. Well, I've got no children. I live alone. Who's going to look after me? I've got nobody. I suppose I'll just... God knows what'll happen to me. No, I've no one. So I just have to manage on my own, don't I? And end up on the floor one day.
You once said to me, we were walking in the woods above Bakewell,
Yes,
and you tripped, and I think you said to me, Phil, if I do fall over in the woods, just leave
yeah.
me there to die.
Yes, I've always felt that. Well, of course, I was just talking of dying in this little flat of mine, but how much better to die in the open fields or outside. I've always felt I'd like to do that. I'd be perfectly happy. It's just to dissolve back into Mother Earth with my face with my face sort of buried in the grass. Oh yes, I'd love that. I'd die in complete peace, just melt back into the earth. Oh, I wouldn't mind on my back looking up at the sky. I'd love that too. And to drop into the sky or into the earth.